Yeah, and from the staircase to this beautiful room, a warm welcome to this conversation within our new caged realities of virtual meetings. Today, a challenge as well as a blessing that allows us to connect with many more interested listeners and readers, wanderers and questioners, that what a local gathering can allow. My name is Anna Jäger, and it is my pleasure to welcome to this panel on languages of imagination and other transitional spaces with Hemley Boum in Paris, José Eduardo Agualusa in Lisbon, Ni Aikwe Parks in London, and in case we can manage the technical difficulties, we will be joined by Colleen Higgs in Cape Town. They're all writers, publishers, poets, and cultural activists of many tongues and imaginations. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
A warm thank you also for your patience, for bearing with us in these technical difficulties, and also another very warm thank you to all the people in the background, the technicians that make this possible, as well as the translators, Jutta Himmelreich and Marina Mauritz, who will make it possible for us to flow in many tongues. On our conversation, the term African literature is an open bracket in which historical echoes can come into their own, as do open questions. One of them is the so-called language question, in which Ngugi wa Thiong'o has been a spearheading reminder and warner of the importance of African writing and African languages as an integral part in the ongoing process of looking at, listening to, narrating anew the colonial pasts that ring loud into our present. Loud in the places that have been plundered and violated by the colonial delusion, as the great late Fred Hickling put it, and equally loud in the places that are built and are still building on the exploitations of that very delusion. We will talk today ways through and to language beyond the linguistics in our guests' writings, as well as in their practices of publishing and mediation of literature. If time allows, we might move away from the dichotomous approach of languages. Beyond this juxtaposition lay the possibilities of talking about language and imagination, rhythm, as well as other narrative, linguistic, and recollecting mobilities. Hemley, your novel Les Maquisards looks at the movements of anti-colonial resistance in 1950s Cameroun. Can you share with us a bit which role did reflection on language play in its writing, also given the fact that language is at the core of the country's tensions today?
Bonjour et je suis ravie d'être.
Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be with you. Les Maquisards represent a very special work concerning the perception of language, the role of literature in fights that were fought against the colonizer. What I would like to note is that beyond language, you have all the imagery that goes with it, or that language transports. And when I worked on this book, there were many things that were not referenced. Fighters, fights, special moments in history that didn't have any reference. I had to do a lot of research, and while I did the research, I became aware of the fact that we can archive information differently from the common ways of archiving, really. If you think of bodies, language, if you think of music, if you think of many other ways of archiving, and of referencing actually language or the idea of language. So maybe language itself can be a place of reference. Bassa, for example, is also a tool to fight with, and so it was just one tool. Language takes other paths also: expression, can be more colorful than if you just use one language.
There's also a pragmatic aspect of things, and you have, I think, like very consciously, of course, kept the rights of your book Les Jours Viennent et Passent for the publication in Africa. Tell us a bit, about this very important move and what it means to be published in Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, or Senegal, for example. Exactly in this, language as a place of reference, thought.
C'est-à-dire que ça fait un moment que je publie et
I've been publishing books for quite a while, and I noticed that my books are not available where I live, and if they're available, they're too expensive for ordinary people to buy them. So my subject also, and also my natural readership, they don't have access to my work. So it was important for me to make this book available to people in Africa, but in Francophone Africa, in Anglophone Africa, at a global level. So my book was supposed to be marketed and be accessible to people on-site, local audiences, and I wanted to use various channels available to me to make my literature accessible to people around me. So, and we did that. We managed to do that for a reasonable price, because very often price plays a very important role. People don't read my works at times if they can't afford them. So also, accessibility is very important. So other cultures should be made accessible the same way. We need technical means also. We need not just books, but other channels that make ways that make literature available to people. So that was very important for me. And also to have people read it in Senegal, in Côte d'Ivoire, and there will be an English translation to be available in Anglophone Africa. And I'll be working with Lusophone publishers also. We've been focusing on colonial literatures, but I would also be very happy to have it translated into African languages as well. My only limit is the price and, of course, the quality of the translation that would come about.
Which still, I think, unfortunately, translating African works into African language is still rather the exception than rather than the norm. So I guess there's like outlets who keep working very hard, to make exactly that possible against the economical restraints, as you have mentioned. Ni, as the director of the Amaata Aidu Center in Ghana, can you tell us a bit what the aim on your focus is in regards to this work, and in kind of building also a form of infrastructure that exactly allows for these publishing forms and writing as well?
I should clarify, I was the founding director of the Amaata Aidu Center, or we call the Aidu Center. And I'm no longer directing it. I'm currently producing literature at Brighton Festival in the UK. But one of the primary aims in founding that center was that if we were going to be involved in teaching creative writing, then we have to look at what we use as foundational texts. So one of the things that is the goal is for for people to read more Southern text, which is to say text from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa itself, when they are learning about writing. Because what tends to happen in most creative writing courses outside of the continent in the West is that people are started on texts which are supposedly seminal Western texts, which then form the foundation of the concept of what good writing is. And there's a hierarchy and a dynamic within that, because those texts also carry philosophies. Languages and cultures carry philosophies within them. And so if those are the foundations, then people start to question their own cultures when they are kind of rising to the challenge of expressing possibilities within their writing. And they start to question, can I talk about my grandmother still walking alongside me, even though she died 12 years ago, where within their own culture they might not. And so we have to understand that there's a great deal of structural support that the colonial languages have had and colonial philosophies have had that are indigenous philosophies haven't had, in the way in which that people have been taught, but also the way in which people have been punished when they try to hold on to certain things. So all of these things come into play, and that dynamic we have to be aware of when we're creating the opportunities. And that was one of the philosophies of the foundation of that. And across the work that I do, whether I'm editing, publishing, whether I'm producing literature. So I met José Eduardo when he read for me at the African Writers Evening. I actually met him at a book festival in Brooklyn, and we kept in touch. But one of the things that I was doing for over a decade in England was running these evenings where we would have African writers from all kind of language backgrounds, from all cultural backgrounds, to come and read, just so people would understand that African writing wasn't just Chinua Achebe. Because again, when we talk about the institutional and structural support that certain narratives have, there is a great deal of investment in the West in nominating people who are the fathers of African literature. And in that process, first of all, many women's voices have been silenced, but also it means that people don't understand the range and complexity and diversity of thought and writing that comes out of the continent. So Chinua Achebe, for instance, was pitted against Ngugi, but actually there's a lot of overlap. And I think this is when you mentioned dichotomies at the beginning. It's unhelpful because it's way more complex than that. And I think, that's what, much of my life's work, including my own writing, is about that. It's about recognizing that there are structures that are invested in keeping things a certain way, but our creativity must go beyond that. And we are blessed to have a multiplicity of languages, and so we should use them.
Which is then also a very political act of making and taking place within.
Well, I mean, I think that statement in itself is part of it, because our very existence is political. Our very existence in the entirety of our being is political. So we went to school and we were told not to speak our own languages within the school corridors, which meant that we could only be part of ourselves in school, right? So in order to be fully yourself, you had to take a political stance. It meant you would speak and be punished. So even though you were just being yourself, you are political. So yes, we are by nature political from birth.
Can you maybe also go a bit more into, you explained the importance of the center's work, but also in which way it is connected, maybe also to a network of infrastructure that it, relies on and feeds on?
Well, I mean, if we go back to the school, just to school, the language that we're taught in, that we're made to write in, that we practice in, is almost always the colonial language. So it stands to reason that our writers then will write in those languages. And so then you create a hierarchy of languages, and those writers are fated as the intelligentsia of the land. So then we think, well, he's intelligent because he uses that language. So all of this plays into a dynamic that filters down into society and how people value their own thought, their own culture, And that's what I mean. There's great investment in it. I mean, you have to understand, even somewhere like Wales, only as recently as 20 years ago, were able to insist on teaching in their schools in Welsh because people would be punished if they use Welsh. And again, you have that dynamic when you're talking to Welsh people or Welsh writers, where the ones who haven't had the opportunity to kind of really explore their past still can feel the hierarchy when they're having those discussions. And the fact that people who speak the colonial languages feel like they can come up to us, even though, as José Eduardo has said in previous conversations, we also own these languages because we have suffered for them. Yeah. Come up to you and say, you speak this language well. Well, I'm not asking you because it's not up to you. Yeah. I've taken this language and I've made something of it that is my own. So these are the kind of structures that I'm talking about.
So we're joined by Colleen now. Very happy to have you back.
Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on what you just said, Ni. In the preparation, you made this reference to, in a way, the former colonial languages being a tool insofar as they are a shoe that is 2 or several sizes too small. You can still, walk in it, but it might hurt, or you have to find creative ways to still stretch and have your toes move in it. And one of José's remarks was that through very many creative ways, so-called colonial languages then have become made into, African languages, also through the massive effort of African writers. And there, also in the example of Portuguese and also the Portuguese between Angola and Brazil, the exchange that happens there, the creative, sparkles and nourishments between these languages. Maybe you can tell a bit about this, and also in which your way carries this heavy inheritance.
I'm sorry, essa pergunta era para quem, Mariana?
Who was this question for?
For you, José.
Ah, para mim. Okay.
Oh, it was for me. I'm sorry. First of all, I am missing a little bit of what is spoken right now, but I'm very sorry. First of all, I would like to say that I agree with Ni perfectly. I think that our greatest challenge is to make sure that our books are going to reach the biggest number of people in Africa. What ends up creating good networks of public libraries, good libraries, and creating new editors. And as mentioned previously, also from Hemley, one of the main problems we have is that the books are really very, very expensive. The books written by African authors are very expensive. In Angola as well as in Mozambique, we have new experiences taking place with new publishers. That are trying to, in many different ways, to bring the books to the public by a more accessible price. And with these books that are much more affordable, it's possible to reach many more people. So we need to edit a greater quantity of books, of course. When we talk about the language, Portuguese along the centuries became more African, of course. I always talk about one of the first books that were published about Angola. It's a book I have here with me, The General History of the Angolan Wars, which was published in 1680. This book was already written in an Afrikaans Portuguese version of Africa. So this means that already from back then, from this period, Portuguese was being integrated and turned into a national entity by the Angolans too. And also Portuguese from Brazil has also taken into has also incorporated many Portuguese, such as Kikombo and Cambudo. I have here two dictionaries. These are dictionaries of Bantuism. These are Bantu words that have been incorporated into Portuguese in Brazil. So there are thousands of words. All these are words that are used in Portuguese in Brazil, but that actually come from the African languages from Angola. In Portuguese in Angola, of course, this number is much higher, of course. So just to agree with what Nee said, in Angola and in Mozambique, they have turned Portuguese into a national language. Portuguese is one of the many languages that is present in these countries. But it is also important to give back the dignity to the languages in Angola. It is very important that there is also literature being written in these languages, and this is not something that happens. So the greatest challenge in Angola and in Mozambique is actually to be able to publish not only in Portuguese, but also in the African languages in Angola and in Mozambique. Naturally, I believe also that many people believe that as there are many more people who speak Portuguese as a mother tongue in Angola, of course, has raised a lot since the independence. But when they go to the Portuguese language, they also lose a part of what of a way they could say it. So it's a cultural illusion when you're just transition from one language to the other.
Yeah, I just waited a bit for the delay in translation, but also to give room, as we said, if one of you wants to react, please feel free. It shouldn't be like a one-way.
No, I agree with José Eduardo. There is that complexity. I mean, languages are abstractions trying to express abstractions. And the abstractions come from a cultural base. So when you factor all those things in, you lose a language, you're losing a hell of a lot. So in my language, for example, in Ga, you can't actually say the word black. You just say dark. So the insult that I've been getting most of my life in the West doesn't exist in my language. It's almost like armor for me.
Yeah.
So it's like you're saying something that doesn't exist in my language. I'm just going to ignore you. It doesn't take away the fact that the person intends to hurt me, but my language is protecting me. If I don't have that language, I don't have that protection. So you have to understand that I am operating in a language that it has the tools to hurt me. And if I didn't have my own, if I didn't have others, then I wouldn't have the way to protect myself. And so these are the complexities that we deal with. And I mean, Portuguese and the African additions to Portuguese, you'll be surprised, go beyond Lusophone Africa, because the Portuguese were also in Ghana, were also in Gambia. They moved around. And when they were doing these things, they were moving sometimes with Africans who we're mediators. And so the Africanization, even within the translation, our understanding of other languages, other colonial languages, we've had these interventions. So we definitely own these languages, but that's not to say that it's all we own or we should feel privileged, because as I said, these are things we suffered for. You know, if you carry the load, then yeah, you must benefit from what you're carrying. That's but how we benefit from it must not be dictated by other people.
Which also means that, and this is also the challenge of our panel in this vast topic, that it's a challenge for the writing itself, but also it's a challenge of editing, of publishing. I also remember that note that you once wrote about the problematics of cover design, especially in Europe, for African writing, and the way that, for example, these protections of your own language you mentioned, but also the musicality and that which can't be said in the English language. If you write this language of your own in the English and then it's been edited out of ignorance and also will, that there's a massive effort then, to work on many levels to be able to really have this writing and in that language that you made and created already. That is exactly that great, I'm lacking the word here, sorry. Result is the wrong word, but sorry, that's there's a lot of, I think, energy that has to go in very many levels that doesn't allow often for the writer to be solely focused on the writing through all the other processes that try to tear all these, I liked your example of protection, to tear these protections out again of a text. Which is also, we can come back also to your endeavors then in editing and publishing, but Colleen, sorry that we had to wait a bit to hear your voice. Can you tell us a little bit about the startings and the motivation of Mujaji Books, which you founded 13 years ago in 2007 as an independent feminist press, publishing Southern African women's fiction, poetry, and biographies. And tell us a bit about where the impulse come from and where you position yourself within that publishing network and industry.
Okay, it feels a bit like I'm coming in from left field and throwing a whole new topic into the mix, but I'll focus on something from what I can gather of what you've been talking about. It was about, it was a political act in a sense to start a small feminist women's press and to make a place for voices that weren't easily going to find publishing homes elsewhere. So that's really what I did and still continue to do. And it's a tiny press, but we have published quite a lot of books, over 100 in the 13 years. But I'm proud of the things that we've done with language, because we've published some poetry, individual poetry collections where there'll be 2 or 3 languages in the text. So the poems will be, but necessarily be translating each other. They'll stand there alone. South Africa is a very multilingual country. So, not everybody understands all the languages, obviously, but the people who can understand those languages will be able to read those texts. And, if they can't understand some of it, that's it shows them what it feels like, in a sense, to be excluded from language at times. It's interesting just to gather the little bits of what people have been saying, because I feel like there's been a lot of interesting experimentation and progressive editing and so on in South Africa, where because it's multilingual, there's a lot of borrowing of words and language from all the languages. And these words and phrases and musicality do appear in the texts of what is a problem, like José was saying, is that, you know, publishing in African languages, publishing the kinds of things that Majaji does, it's not as common and as much as it should be. You know, there's a big gap. So there's quite a lot of publishing in English and in Afrikaans, which is the Dutch heritage language, but it's also been Africanized, Afrikaans, from the Dutch. And not just, with all kinds of languages and the experience of living here and the history of what has happened, you know, over the centuries, a lot of it terrible. So, yeah, I mean, just one example of something that I've done is to publish 2 books. One was a poetry collection and one is a novel in a language that's called Kaaps, which is, up to now, the last 10 years or so, has been more of a spoken language. And there has been a move to start publishing, but it's at very early stages still. But so this was a crime fiction novel published in Kaaps, which feels like a very exciting thing to do. I mean, I also feel like in some ways I'm not actually equipped to do that kind of publishing, but I mean, I did it. You know, because if you aren't steeped in that language, it's hard to, as the publisher, know exactly what it is you're doing. And I think that can be the problem for publishers for all of these questions. You know, you take risks, you experiment, but what are you actually doing? So we need to grow a new generation of editors and people who are involved in this work.
What is Kaaps?
I'll stop there.
May I ask? What is Kaaps? The language?
Oh, it's a spoken version of Afrikaans, but it's spoken by so-called Cape Coloured people. So, you know.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, just wanted to check.
Yeah.
Because I think it's used quite a lot in music, right?
Yes, and in, you know, performance and so on. And it's a very vivid and vibrant language. So, yeah, it's interesting to see it written down and to try and make it consistent in a sense, because it isn't like that. You know, it's like catching a live animal or a live herd of animals or, you know, group of them and trying to make them into one. I don't know. Sorry, I'm getting. I don't know. I'm not sure that metaphor works, but yeah. I mean, what I'm trying to say is
and this book, was it distributed? Did this book get published and distributed?
Yeah, it's published. It's called Any Shadows, and yeah, it's been published. And it's been out for a year now. It's sold relatively well. I mean, South African numbers for literary fiction, or, you know, this is crime fiction, but it's of a literary bent, aren't huge. You know, I think we've sold like 700 or 800 copies, which is actually quite good for us, but it's not an exciting number to publishers that aren't independent publishers, I think.
Yeah, José.
Well, that's good numbers. I work in publishing with a small press, so I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that is good numbers as far as I'm concerned.
Since there is this expertise and following of especially small presses that trying to find alternative ways, you know, in publishing, making it more affordable, and also bringing African languages into publishing, one must almost say again, because there has been a time where, you know, publishing in African languages was already stronger than for a while, and now we see other smaller ventures, you know, finding ways to do it in the time we are now. Could you share some observations, all of you who've mentioned, you know, that there is exactly this happening now, what the strategies are, what are the ways to make this possible against so many odds? I'm giving this to the round.
Yeah.
Hemley,
I mean, I could say something.
when you did, sorry.
Yeah, Nee?
No, go ahead.
No, I was asking Hemley because she kept the rights to her book in Africa and played a part in kind of getting it available at affordable prices. What was that experience like?
C'est une expérience qui a lieu en ce moment parce qu'elle s'est faite sur mon dernier livre.
It's an experience that takes place now, where I'm working on the rights because I would like to keep the rights, and I'm going to negotiate with editors like Burney in Ivory Coast, and also for the francophone part, Bakwa Edition, which is Nigerian Cameroonian co-effort or cooperation. Actually, we want to expand to other authors as well, of course, because once a book is available at a reasonable price, you don't have to, worry so much about buying books from Europe, expensive books from Europe. But I'd like to make a small remark, maybe a psychological item here in connection with languages or translations. You have all these questions of identity, questions of language, and language is where I live. Actually, language is the space that I live in, and I don't want to have a situation occur where I am disconnected from myself and where I live. I speak French, I speak other local languages or mother tongues. French I'm very intimate with, but I'm also very much at ease with my mother tongue. I'm not going to say French is not my language. It's my language just as much as all the other languages are my languages, and I flow from one to the next, quite at ease there. But the metaphorical things, of course, are expressed differently, and we've talked about, or other authors have talked about the violence in certain colonial languages, or the use of those, or punishment and things. There are, of course, 2 or 3 different languages at play at times. If you think of Pidgin and other languages that have to be mixed, local languages mixed with English, with French, and you come to a sort of a creolization. And I think it's really necessary to rehabilitate African languages because they transport imagery or an imaginary world that is going to get lost if we don't do anything to save that. On the other hand, I would like to also say that it's now it's difficult for me to understand because the line is cutting. I speak French. I speak French quite fluently, but I don't know if I'm express myself clearly if I say I wouldn't use French in an Africanized way, or I wouldn't want to move away from it, at the expense of my other mother tongues. I use them all at an equal level.
Colleen, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that, our history with publishing in African languages, I think it's shifting, but there were sort of gatekeepers who worked at the universities who wanted the languages to be published in a sort of, or to be written in a pure way, so that it was like high, pure isiXhosa or isiZulu. And, you know, they didn't like these academics, didn't apparently like the use of, you know, vernacular, not vernacular, the spoken, and, you know, the introduction of slang and English words, and, you know, especially now with all the technology, you know, they're not going to be words for iPhone or mobile phone or whatever, website. Those words are just changed in, you know, just sort of there'll be a suffix or something that will make it into fitting into that language. So that I think there is still some of that, but I think it is shifting. You know, I think that all of these things you're talking about, there's, you know, it's just very complex, and there's a lot of politics involved in who gets to decide what about how a language is written, about how it's published, who will actually publish it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you touch on something with the academics there, because I think if you think about what we're talking about, underneath it all is this notion of purity, which people who like to control things are obsessed with. And the one thing you can say for almost everyone that is African is you're going to be a hybrid. So just by the influences, the languages, whatever, just by the fact of the colonial encounter, we are hybrid. And so once you bring in the notion of purity, you're also saying you're trying to exclude us. And this, I think, is the germ that is in a lot of all of this. Even that early debate between Achebe and Ngugi is to do with that. The people who are invested in one side, in each side, are thinking of purity. But I mean, what is purity? Purity is something completely false from the beginning. There's no pure thing on earth. And so we should just be allowed to be our full selves. And people will have to shift to understand. I mean, it's like when you're having a conversation. You know, I say something to Hemley, she doesn't quite get me, and then I repeat it, and I shift it slightly, and suddenly she gets it. I mean, that's what the word's about. It's about dialogue. So, yeah.
Exactly.
But interesting that you should talk about the professors, yeah.
I mean, I think that is the power of English, not to be you know, imperialist about English at all, but it's a language that is fine with, you know, changing and incorporating new words and breaking old ones, and sort of, you know, there isn't any, you know, I mean, obviously there are some stuffy old people who write into the newspapers, but yeah, it's a very fluid, flexible language. So,
I mean, I think I would stop short of crediting English for it. I think the language has broken its bounds. It's not somebody saying we're fine with it. It's just people are using it. And when you have a place with a population the size of of India, that has a language, you can't go and tell them you can't put veranda into my language. Because they're using it and they're more than you are. And it, you know, and these things travel. So I mean, I don't give credit to any colonial language for having words from those words are enriching those languages. And then they meet up every now and then and they decide which ones they're going to put in the dictionary when we're using 10,000 times more than they're putting in the dictionary. And I think our local languages have always done that. That's why we have Creoles or so-called Creoles, because we mix very easily. My own language, our pidgins, they're always shifting and nobody has a problem with it. You know, so I think once you get to institutions, you have professors, the authority is related to how much they can control and mark things. So they don't want things to shift because it affects their authority. That's my conception of it. So I think it's really interesting what, right at the beginning, José Eduardo was saying about Portuguese. Yeah, I mean, there might be words that are not in a Portuguese dictionary, but you go to Angola, you go to Mozambique, you go to Cape Verde, you go to Brazil, and everybody will understand you.
Je suis d'accord avec Nié là-dessus. C'est vrai que si on parle tous anglais dans le monde, ce n'est pas parce que c'est une belle langue, c'est sûrement une belle langue.
I agree with Nee on that aspect, you know. This is a consequence of colonialism. It's metaphoric violence, you know. You have imposed languages, and then if you don't give expression, I mean, opportunity to express to other language, this is a form of violence, you know. You have to, it's difficult to compare English to other languages because just because the whole world speaks English, it's not easy. We shouldn't just say it's a flexible language because this flexibility exists in other languages as well.
Yeah.
José, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, I would like to just make a comment here about one situation, which is the influence of Portuguese from Angola nowadays in Portuguese from Portugal now. So mainly due to the power of our popular music from Angola, very young people, the youth in Portugal tends to use Portuguese from Angola. So the Portuguese from Portugal start talking like the Angolan people.
Yeah, I guess again, all these cultural journeys and traveling saying bullshit again at this idea of a purity of any form of cultural expression. Another example, exactly.
Maybe if I could just another point, if you take away from Portuguese from Brazil all the African words, if you take all these African words out, Brazilian people are still going to be able to speak Portuguese, but they're not going to be able to be Brazilian anymore.
En français, ils ne peuvent pas être brésiliens.
It is very different. They can speak the language, but they're not going to be able to feel Brazilian, to be Brazilian people anymore. Because the Brazilian people, in order to be Brazilian, you need to have incorporated these words and this culture that came along with these words.
Then in a way, another form of maybe then lived protection. I'm afraid our time is already up, which is really showing very keenly the massive challenge of putting such a big topic and issue and lived experience also in this format, but I think we have tapped on very many important aspects in, you know, the big range of from writing, from you know, creating creative and literary text, up to the you know, the structural realities that play such a massive part in getting it to who's going to read it or who's not going to read it. I would have liked to continue that conversation with you for much longer. It's definitely at least a topic that can fill a conference, if not many lives, as it has. So thank you very much for being so brave in getting with us, in trying to already look at it in this way, and also for your patience in this new frame that we are experiencing and experimenting with. It was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for being with us.
Ja, Herr Boos, herzlich willkommen. Wir freuen uns, dass Sie hier sind heute. Sie sind sozusagen in doppelter Funktion bei uns, als Leiter der Frankfurter Buchmesse, aber auch als Vorstandsvorsitzender von Litprom. Und genau, also Anita Jafari hat es vorhin schon kurz angesprochen. Die Öffnung der Buchmesse als internationales Großevent ist im Grunde ja eingeleitet worden durch den Vorgänger Herr Weithaas 1980. Wo stehen wir denn da heute? Was heißt denn internationales Arbeiten? Was ist denn aus Ihrer Sicht mal so eine Bestandsaufnahme und wo gehen wir da hin?
Ja, Peter Weithaas hat vor genau 40 Jahren, also seit dem Bestehen von Litprom, immer darüber gesprochen, wie international die Frankfurter Buchmesse zu sein hat. Und wir haben das in den letzten Jahrzehnten nur einfach weiterentwickelt. Für uns ist wichtig der Rechtehandel, der im Hintergrund stattfindet. Natürlich ist die Frankfurter Buchmesse ein riesiges Publikumsereignis, sicher auch eines der größten Literaturfestivals auf der Welt. Aber tatsächlich steht dahinter auch Geschäft. Die Frankfurter Buchmesse war immer so ein Dreiklang: Kultur, Wirtschaft und Politik. Auch immer die politische Bühne. Und 1980 hat man gesagt, wir wollen einen Schwerpunkt setzen, wir wollen ein Gastland haben, einen Ehrengast. Und das war zu dem Zeitpunkt Schwarzafrika. Und so begann tatsächlich diese Internationalität. So begann es auch mit Litprom. Ich glaube, Schwarzafrika ist heutzutage kein korrekter Ausdruck mehr.
Nein, wir würden das auf keinen Fall mehr so nennen. Und auch überhaupt die Idee, einen ganzen Kontinent als Land einzuladen, ist sicherlich nicht mehr das Bild, das wir heute uns wünschen.
Ja, die Frankfurter Buchmesse lebt von der Diversität. Und das bedeutet natürlich, dass wir versuchen, nicht in Kategorien zu denken, sondern wir versuchen, die Menschen aus den Ländern, die Autoren in den Vordergrund zu stellen. Jeden für sich, der tatsächlich auch eine ganz andere Sicht auf sein Thema oder seine Herkunft oder seine Weiterentwicklung hat.
Das finde ich einen spannenden Punkt. Was heißt denn diese Diversität oder wie lässt sich das denn mit dieser Gastlandpolitik auch zusammenführen? Vielleicht können Sie da ein bisschen was zu erzählen.
Na, für uns ist es wichtig, und es ist seit Jahrzehnten so, dass tatsächlich Literatur keine Einbahnstraße ist, sondern dass sie übersetzt wird, weil wir finden eigentlich nur den Zugang zum Denken von anderen Menschen über Literatur oder indem wir ihnen zuhören können. Und das war uns sehr wichtig. Und oft fallen halt kleine Länder durch das Raster. Auch vor dem Kolonialgedanken her. Das Angelsächsische war viele, viele Jahrzehnte übermächtig. Ja, und das ist etwas, was sich gerade ändert. Da ist viel mehr Offenheit da. Und das ist entstanden natürlich auch durch Institutionen wie Litprom, die dafür sorgen, dass kleine Sprachen übersetzt werden, dass Themen ihre Leser finden, was nicht einfach ist, ja, sich auf eine afrikanische Kultur einzulassen.
Was heißt das zum Beispiel konkret im Fall Gastland Kanada?
Na, Kanada ist natürlich ein sehr spezieller Fall in dem Sinne. Ja. Kanada ist französischsprachig, es ist englischsprachig, es hat eine starke indigene Bevölkerung. Und die gleichzeitig ins Licht zu rücken, das ist natürlich unser großes Thema, dass wir nicht darauf hereinfallen, die großen Stimmen zu nehmen, sondern die Vielfalt in den Vordergrund zu stellen.
KfW-Stiftung hat ja viele Nachbarschaften mit Litprom, kann man sagen. Wir haben ähnliche Förderbereiche und auch in vielerlei Hinsicht eine ähnliche Brückenfunktion. Auch die KfW-Stiftung sucht im Grunde die Förderung von neuen Stimmen aus dem nicht unbedingt nur globalen Süden, sondern diesen besagten Kontinenten, Lateinamerika, Afrika, Asien. Das sind natürlich Zuschreibungen, die sich in transkulturellen, transnationalen Zeiten kaum noch halten lassen. Wir stellen uns die Frage, was heißt das heute? Wo ist da auch der Zukunftsausblick und wo geht die Reise hin? Ich stelle mir vor, in den 80er Jahren war der Auftrag von Litprom ein anderer. Da ging es erstmal darum, die etablierten Verlage überhaupt als solche zu finden, zu sagen, hier sind Stimmen, die habt ihr noch nicht im Programm, erweitert eure Programme. Aber die Frage ist so ein bisschen, wie geht die Reise heute weiter? Das interessiert uns, das interessiert auch Litprom und ist auch ein Grund, ja, warum wir diese Panel-Diskussionen hier heute so in der Form stattfinden lassen.
Ja, ich glaube, das Wichtige ist, wie gesagt, dass es nicht so eine Einwegstraße wird, dass man trotzdem die Vielfalt zeigen kann und zeigen kann, dass es Stimmen gibt, die nicht gehört werden, wenn wir sie hier nicht sichtbar machen.
Richtig.
Aber großes Thema für mich ist da auch das Thema der Co-Produktion. Ich weiß, dass die KfW Workshops gemacht hat in Ägypten mit jungen Autoren und sowas finde ich einfach super wichtig, ja? Sich mit deutschen Autoren, in dem Fall ägyptische Autoren, zusammenzutun. Ich würde mir das wünschen, dass wir das auch häufiger mit afrikanischen Autorinnen machen könnten. Es geht darum, gemeinsam was zu entwickeln und tatsächlich damit auch die Sichtbarkeit herzustellen. Nicht einfach eine Lupe drauf zu halten, sondern das gemeinsam zu tun.
Ja, also dieser kollaborative Punkt, der ist in der Tat ein großer Punkt, auch ein schwieriger Punkt, was dann die administrative Umsetzung auch betrifft. Wie ziehe ich ein Förderprogramm aus, jetzt aus Sicht einer Stiftung gesprochen, das regional stattfindet. Das Projekt, das Sie ansprechen, heißt Short Stories, haben wir in Kooperation mit dem Goethe-Institut gemacht, das in diesem Zusammenhang natürlich ein wahnsinnig wichtiger Partner ist für die Arbeit, die kollaborative Arbeit vor Ort. Wir haben ein ein neues Programm aufgesetzt im südlichen Afrika für zeitgenössische bildende Kunst. In dem Zusammenhang, wo es darum geht, dass junge Kulturschaffende aus dem südlichen Afrika sich innerhalb des Kontinents vernetzen. Die Frage ist natürlich immer, wie bauen wir dann die Brücke zwischen Europa da wieder hin? Genau, also da denke ich, stehen wir noch vor größeren Herausforderungen. Aber wie kristallisiert sich denn das heraus in der Arbeit der Buchmesse?
Na, für uns ist wichtig,
also was für ein Tool ist das?
Sie haben die Partnerschaften angesprochen, die sind natürlich super wichtig. Ja? Wir arbeiten eng mit dem Auswärtigen Amt zusammen, wir arbeiten eng mit Goethe zusammen, wir arbeiten zusammen. Ja? Wir haben ein gemeinsames Ziel, aber jeder hat so einen anderen Ansatz. Unser Ansatz ist auch, die Menschen nach Frankfurt zu bringen und sie mit dem internationalen Verlagswesen zusammenzubringen. Wir haben Einladungsprogramme, ja, wo wir sagen, junge Leute haben die Möglichkeit, hier durch Deutschland in die Verlage zu gehen, zu sehen, was machen die für ein Verlagsprogramm, wie arbeiten die. Ja, und dann sind sie auf der Frankfurter Buchmesse. Und mit diesem Programm erreichen wir, dass ein Netzwerk entsteht, auch unter diesen jungen Verlegern, egal wo sie herkommen. Und jetzt im Digitalen ist es ja einfach, Kontakt zu halten. Ja.
Das stimmt.
Ja? Das ist wunderbar.
Die Frage, die sich so ein bisschen stellt, ist natürlich, wie können wir diesen Netzwerkgedanken wirklich auch als kollaborativen Netzwerkgedanken aufrechterhalten, sodass sich das auch in die Breite streut. Also es gibt ja auch tolle Messen. Jetzt gerade hat stattgefunden die South African Book Fair. Ich habe über Instagram und sämtliche Kanäle alles verfolgt. Das ist natürlich toll. Vielleicht diesen kollaborativen Spirit, kriegen wir den auch auf infrastruktureller Ebene hin. Das wäre ja ein Wunsch.
Ja, wir haben vor vielen Jahren tatsächlich auch in Südafrika die Buchmesse mit aufgebaut, mit dem südafrikanischen Verlegerverband zusammen, mit dem Ziel, einen Treffpunkt für das südliche Afrika zu schaffen. Und wie Sie sagen, es ist super schwierig. Ja? Sie haben mit den ökonomischen Bedingungen, Sie haben mit den kulturellen und Sie haben aber auch mit den politischen Bedingungen zu tun. Umso wichtiger ist, dass wir ermöglichen, dass wir nur unterstützen, ja? Oder vielleicht auch nur Moderator sind, um dann dort mit der Bevölkerung oder mit den Autorinnen, mit den Verlegern vor Ort was zu schaffen. Wir können nichts überstülpen.
40 Jahre Litprom, also dann würde ich sagen, wir sind gespannt, wie es die nächsten 40 Jahre weitergeht.
Ja, es wird sicher ein kooperatives Projekt sein. Frankfurter Buchmesse, Litprom, KfW, viele andere Stakeholder auch vor Ort. Also das wird sehr spannend werden für uns alle.
Das denke ich auf jeden Fall auch. Vielen Dank, Herr Boos.
Danke.
Wir freuen uns jetzt sehr, das nächste Panel anzukündigen. Wir haben Bettina Gappa, Masa Mengiste und Yvonne Ivour, die jetzt gemeinsam mit Anna Jäger den Blick nach vorne richten werden. Herzlichen Dank.